So yeah, so I offered to share some perspectives on Vision Zero today because there is currently a statewide Vision Zero bill in the legislature and at the state, and almost every county in Hawaii is currently engaged in developing Vision Zero action plans at some level. I think Kauai is the only county that is not actually actively pursuing Vision Zero as a name, but they're actually doing a lot of really good work that would be considered Vision Zero. So Vision Zero is a really popular brand at the moment, and in some circles it's called other things. Sometimes it's just considered to be sort of an extension of complete streets. Sometimes you'll hear it referred to as safe systems or the safe systems approach. And in another 5 years, it might be called something different. I think actually we're already starting to see the problem with these sort of branding exercises is we're already starting to see some of the luster come off of Vision Zero as a brand. But the principles are really sound and the principles are strong. And we can talk about why maybe the brand is problematic later. But a lot of times people consider or talk about Vision Zero as this really progressive or really radical approach to traffic management and traffic safety. But the core premise of Vision Zero is really simple and really humane. And that is that traffic deaths are unacceptable, avoidable, and presentable. And that's all. That's it. That's it. And if that's true, then it stands to reason that we should try to eliminate them, right? So that's all Vision Zero is. Vision Zero says that we should commit to eliminating traffic violence. It is a systematic commitment to eliminating traffic fatalities by a set date, and that's all. So when I hear that Vision Zero is too radical or too progressive, my response usually starts about 100 years ago, and I know some of you have seen this already. In the early 1920s, there was a widespread panic about motor vehicle violence and the sheer scale of motor vehicle deaths. It was a massive thing. I love sharing this newspaper clipping. As you can see, that is the Grim Reaper driving an automobile and running over the bodies of children. So they were not hesitant to describe how they felt about this problem. There were huge protests. There was intersection blockings with moms and baby carriages. It was a big deal. It was a big problem. This was 100 years ago, and at the time there were a lot of solutions proposed, and the solutions that were proposed, again, this is 1920s, 100 years ago, included things like requiring cars to have speed governors, banning them from city centers, stringent liability rules for drivers, transit priority in policy and design. But what happened instead was there was a PR campaign designed by an industry group. This is not a conspiracy theory. This really happened. An industry group called Motordom came up with an alternative strategy to actually doing something about it. And what they came up with was the invention of the term jaywalker. So if you're not familiar with jaywalker, jay actually back in the day was a term for a hick or a hillbilly. So by creating the term jaywalker, what they were saying is only unsophisticated people don't know that streets are for cars and not for people. And by walking in the car, by walking in the street, you were revealing yourself to be a hick and revealing yourself to not understand how sophisticated city streets work, right? Kind of wild. Whether you think the strategy worked or not kind of depends on what you think the goal was. We've actually sold a lot of cars in the century since, and we've sold a lot of oil in the century since. So maybe it was a really good strategy if you're Motordom and you work for the industry. On the other hand, traffic crashes in the U.S. kill the equivalent of a fully loaded 747 crashing with no survivors every 3 days in the U.S. So think about that. We are better at launching people across the country in rocket buses than we are at designing cities where people can get to work safely. Also turns out that we've spent nearly a century rationalizing and normalizing traffic deaths as inevitable collateral in the name of progress and convenience. The systems that we rely on to connect us to work, to school, to worship, to goods, to civic participation, to recreation, and to each other very routinely carry a death penalty for even minor lapses in attention and judgment. And we are, by and large, pretty complacent about that. And we're so complacent that asserting something as simple as traffic deaths are unavoidable, are unacceptable, avoidable, and preventable inspires these really, really visceral responses, right? So we hear things like there's this too expensive, or it's too disruptive, or it's a fantasy. There's this skepticism and cynicism and sometimes outright hostility to the idea of Vision Zero. And I'm always really puzzled by that. I'm always really taken aback by that, because you never hear someone say, well, curing cancer, that's too expensive or too disruptive. It's a fantasy, right? Cancer is no less daunting of a problem, no less complicated, no less expensive. But in our storytelling, it's a lofty and noble vision. But why is Vision Zero a fantasy? Why is it a joke? Why is it cynical to talk about Vision Zero? From a planning and an engineering perspective, there's not much mystery to the steps that we need to take to cure traffic violence, is there? We can do the design and engineering work to put us on track. It's the same solutions that were proposed and ignored 100 years ago. Traffic crashes aren't the leading cause of preventable childhood death in the United States because we're bad engineers or bad planners, or because we don't have enough technology. The real reason is that the real problem is that we haven't decided traffic violence is a problem worth solving yet. So I'm a glutton for punishment. Maybe I'm a glutton for punishment. Maybe I'm really dedicated to my job, one or the other. I get Google alerts. I have a bunch of Google alerts. Sabrina has seen my Google alerts for traffic crashes and pedestrian crashes and bike crashes and stuff. So every morning I wake up to a whole string of terrible news that happened yesterday all over the state. So a little while back, I got this one early in the morning. Man 38 in critical condition after pedestrian accident near airport. If you pay attention, you get these a lot, and you'll see headlines written like this a lot. But from the headline, you don't know, did he trip? Did he hit his head? Did he, get his dog run in front of him and knock him over? And beyond the headline, the first edition of the story has another problem. So look at this. 38-year-old man was taken to the hospital in critical condition after a pedestrian accident. Accident occurred shortly before 1:30 a.m. at the intersection of Nimitz Highway and Ohia Street, Hohohia Street. According to EMS, paramedics responded to the scene and found the man in critical condition after he had been struck by a sedan. They treated and transported him to trauma. Driver refused treatment. So what do you notice there? There's not even a car mentioned until the concluding paragraph. The first 3 paragraphs don't mention a car being involved at all, right? That's a wild way to talk about violence. So I read that and I started thinking, well, what if we talked about other kinds of violence the way we talk about automobile violence? What if we talked about President Lincoln being killed by an assassin as President Lincoln dead after a theater accident? It would be ridiculous, right? The way we talk about violence that involves cars is way different than the way we talk about any other kind of cultural violence. So why does that matter? It matters because storytelling is how we start to understand and solve problems. And our journalism is the first draft of that shared story. So, for example, when you tell a story that says man 38 in critical condition after a pedestrian accident, and then your response to that, your solution to the problem is distracted walking laws. You pass distracted walking laws that target phone users and other people that are walking. Well, then it doesn't work. So your pedestrian deaths rise despite risky walking crackdown, and you continue the cycle of telling a bad narrative of what the actual problem is. We end up with a feedback loop of faulty storytelling, misguided solutions, and more bad outcomes. So an aside, this is not just a Honolulu-specific problem, right? This is a national issue. This is the New York Times last fall. Yes, texting while walking is relatively safe, but still annoying. Even an article vindicating pedestrians as not actually the problem still manages to find a way to blame the victims or make light of the fact that people that are maybe distracted don't deserve to die for being distracted. So when you're behind the wheel of your car, comfort and convenience are paramount. Amenities like entertainment centers and smart screens and soundproofing are common. But when you're on the road as a pedestrian, if you don't take extraordinary precaution, the consequences are on you. From there, it's easy to ratchet up the baseline, right? Pedestrian flags seem like a really good safety measure at first until you imagine where we put the burden of responsibility for a child or for a senior who fails to use one and is hit by a car that fails to yield at a marked crossing as required by law. Is the narrative of shared responsibility between that pedestrian and that driver helpful, or is that harmful? So go back to the article. Police said alcohol appears to have been a factor on the part of the pedestrian. And with the holidays weekend coming up, we urge everyone to be responsible while commuting. I don't know about you guys. I've been involved with a lot of conversations about intoxicated pedestrians, where as soon as someone said, oh, well, he was drunk, he was walking drunk, that was case closed. It's the end of the story. We were no longer empathetic. We're no longer trying to make this street safer for the user because it was the user's own fault. But I have a counter proposal to that. And the counter proposal is that you can learn a lot about a city's commitment to safety of vulnerable users by how safe it is to get home drunk. And that's not a joke. I think it's funny to think about, but I think it's actually really true. And I think here's a couple of examples. Wheelchair users in the US are much more likely to be killed in traffic than other pedestrians, by around 35 to 40%, depending on the jurisdiction, depending on when you ask. This actual photo right here is from Honolulu. It's a little bit older, but it's someone unable to get up a curb ramp because they're in a wheelchair and the intersection doesn't have a curb ramp. We also know here in Hawaii, we have the deadliest roads in the nation for senior pedestrians. You can see that the National Complete Streets Coalition found that 42% of pedestrian deaths in Hawaii were seniors, and apparently approximately about 15% of the population is 65 and over. So that is a huge overrepresentation of seniors in our fatalities. So one last thing about NIMITs. A lot of motor vehicle. So I was out there once. So I saw this article, and you see these articles about NIMITs a lot, right? And I was out there once, coming back from the airport, and was waiting for the bus. I'm sitting at the bus stop there, and I saw a guy just it was a homeless fellow, and he was in the street, and he had a cart with him, and he was just pushing his cart down the middle of the street. And I thought, well, that's why people are getting hurt. What's going on? Like, why is he going down the middle of the street? And no wonder, it's dark out. The lighting under there is not great. What's this guy doing out there? Why isn't he using the sidewalk? And I look and I follow him and I notice, and this is not a great picture because I didn't want to invade the guy's privacy and it was a dark picture. But what you can kind of see there is he's walking in the street because there is an 8-foot sidewalk as you need and as code requires, but there's also a pylon holding up the highway. And then in the middle of the gap between the pylon and the curb, there's a bus stop sign. So there's actually no way for someone to move a grocery cart, which has their belongings on the sidewalk. So he had no choice but to walk in the street. So when you hear the story about somebody, you assume that they made an ill-informed decision, but they very likely could have made the only decision that was available to them. And of course, if it's unsafe or impassable by a grocery cart, it's probably also impassable by someone in a wheelchair or a mother with a stroller, right? So these are problems where you can learn a lot by the cases that get written off maybe as marginal cases. So the barriers and gaps and deficiencies that put intoxicated pedestrians at risk or high-risk people at even higher risk also put other vulnerable users with cognitive or mobility impairments at heightened risk too. So if we really believe in equity, we should take them very, very seriously. So that's why, if it's unsafe, if you live in a city where a lot of people are getting hit when they're being blamed because they're walking home drunk, maybe it's not. Maybe it should be safer for people to walk home drunk. Maybe we need better barriers, better sidewalks, better separation between fast-moving traffic and imperfectly behaving pedestrians. So for years, engineers and planners talked about the 3 E's of traffic safety. The traditional 3 E's are engineering, enforcement, education. That's probably pretty self-explanatory. And policy considered those things to be mostly the domain of transportation programs. Vision Zero and other kind of progressive movements like to talk about 6 E's, and this varies a little bit depending on who you're talking to or what program you're looking at. But there's essentially, in addition to the enforcement, engineering, and education, we add engagement, equity, and evaluation. And I want to go through those real quick. The multivalent approach looks a lot more like a public health program than a transportation program. I think it's a really interesting thing to think about when we go through this. And a lot of these things are not programs or departments that transportation departments are staffed or funded to or equipped to manage by themselves without support from a larger group. So the first is engineering. We've talked about that. Streets are made of asphalt and concrete, but they are not set in stone. I think this is a kind of a funny cartoon joke, right? So imagine if we designed streets for cars the same way we designed bike lanes and sidewalks. Dang, the road ends again. I hate sharing the tracks with the train, and they just dumped you right out on the train track. Well, that's how we manage pedestrian and bicycle safety, right? This is a pretty revealing chart that I share a lot. So if you are hit by a vehicle traveling 20 miles an hour, 9 out of 10 times you're going to survive. If you're hit by a vehicle traveling 30 miles an hour, about half the time you're going to survive. And if you're hit by a vehicle traveling 40 miles an hour, 9 out of 10, roughly 9 out of 10 people will not survive being hit by a vehicle traveling, pedestrians that is, will not survive being hit by a vehicle traveling 40 miles an hour. So that's pretty sobering, right? That tells you how much we can do just by controlling speed in areas where there's a lot of interaction between cars and people. So I don't know if people follow this, but there's a proposal right now to put a pedestrian overpass. There was a horrible crash at Kamakea Street in Ala Moana a couple of years ago, about 3 years ago now, I think. 3 years, 2 years? That killed 3 pedestrians. It was a high-speed police chase, and 3 pedestrians were killed. And one of the responses to that has been to propose a bike and pedestrian overpass over the road, and I think there was a lot of enthusiasm for it. $16 million. This cost. A lot of it was federal funding. Wasn't eligible to be spent on other things, but $16 million is a lot of money. And one of the quotes in the kind of accompanying material as this thing was getting hearings was, "The ultimate pedestrian safety measure is to remove the interaction of pedestrians and vehicles by providing an elevated walkway to cross a significant roadway." So that's half right, right? And the ultimate pedestrian safety measure is to remove the interaction, But I would also argue that making pedestrian safety less convenient in the interest of making vehicle speed more convenient is not actually the ultimate pedestrian safety measure. Again, what you're doing when you're creating an overpass rather than controlling vehicle speed is creating an additional barrier to people doing the right thing. You're not creating something that is comfortable and convenient for people to use. So if it was up to me and we had a $16 million to spend on pedestrian safety on Ala Moana, I think there's a lot of things you could do if your goal was actually pedestrian safety and not continuing not to inconvenience drivers. So education, all road users must understand our rights and responsibilities and how our decisions impact others. There's a lot of different ways that can be approached. There's bicycle-friendly driver programs. There's media education. We talked a little bit about the media piece earlier. There's a campaign right now called Crash Not Accident that's been Transportation Alternatives created a couple of years ago. And the gist of it is when we talk about traffic violence as accidents, that implies that there's no causality or there's no responsibility. And we have this habit of doing that. We talk about someone who was in a pedestrian accident or someone who was in a bike accident. Well, they're all crashes, right? And at some level, every crash is a failure of some kind. There's a failure of education or infrastructure or attention. And so calling out those failures is really important to solving the problem, because if we just call them accidents, then there's very little path forward to actually solving them. So this is some other examples. There's pedestrian safety gardens, or bike safety gardens is one example, one of those below. Portland Vision Zero Plan out of 20 is Plenty campaign. So lots of different examples of how education can work. Evaluation. If we don't measure it, we can't fix it. So that's kind of the domain of public health. That's what we do a lot, is evaluation, is try to figure out when we make claims, when we try to do things, how do we know that they do what they're supposed to? An example I like to harp on a lot. So the Honolulu Police Department receives a grant every year for years, has received federal NHTSA grants, which is National Highway Travel Safety Administration. And they offer pedestrian and bike safety grants to states and local agencies. So the HPD applies for this money, and with the money, they actually set up and pay police overtime to give tickets to pedestrians and bicyclists. And the most common bicycling ticket is for not having bike registration. So they give a lot of tickets out for people not having bike registration, and the most common pedestrian tickets are in downtown. And I live in downtown. I don't know if people spend a lot of time there, but there's not a ton of fatalities, it turns out. Traffic moves pretty slowly. The streets are pretty narrow compared to other parts of the state, compared to higher speed areas. It's not the most dangerous place, and it's not a place where jaywalking is likely to lead, most likely perhaps to lead to a fatality. But they do park out there and get police overtime for giving pedestrian jaywalking tickets. Again, from an evaluation perspective, you would be correct to ask, do we have any evidence that this works? So this is, public safety money. This is pedestrian and bicycle safety money that's ostensibly intended to make it safer for people to bike and walk. And I've yet to see, I've been asking for a long time, what evidence we have that this expenditure actually results in people in fewer fatalities or serious crashes. And I don't think there's any good evidence of that. So the next piece is engagement, right? Vision Zero means everything's on the table. So that means that everybody has to be at the table. And the big two there is political commitment and multidisciplinary leadership. Vision Zero reminds us that media, public health, social services, schools, community and social service groups, and most importantly, public officials have to be actively engaged in an ongoing way in traffic safety. It can't just be something that an elected official, a legislature, a governor tasks the Department of Health with and says, get this done, and doesn't allocate resources and doesn't allocate political cover to, because it is a political and social and cultural problem and a public health problem just as much as it's a transportation problem, right? So it has to be a collective commitment. It has to be a top-down and bottom-up commitment if we want to actually do something. And then equity piece is identity informs vulnerability. And we've talked quite a bit about that in this group, and I think that's what this group is devoted to. I wanted to go through a couple of examples that I find really compelling. We know that disability, age, gender, race, socioeconomic status, geography all play a role in our health, our safety, our mobility, our access to food, education, healthcare, recreational space, and civic participation. Here's an example. I used to live and work in San Jose. I ran Walk San Jose for a year. This map was created as part of San Jose's Vision Zero plan. So what you're looking at here is in orange is the San Jose communities of concern. And the communities of concern is census tracts with a higher than normal concentration of both low-income and minority households, and also considers limited English proficiency, zero-vehicle households, seniors 75 and older, people with disabilities, single-parent families, cost-burden renters. So you take all those census factors and you create this we call the communities of concern map, and that orange area is the area where we're most focused and the most disparities exist. And the blue, it turns out that in San Jose, and this is actually true of a lot of cities, about 3% of the city streets account for about 50% of total fatal crashes in the state. So that's like a very stark, concentration of attention. And what happens when you overlap the blue, which is our high crash corridor, and our communities of concern area, you see that there's a huge overlap between our communities of concern, which are otherwise burdened by, other social determinants of their health and access, and fatalities from crashes. So that's really compelling and troubling, right? That's a big deal. More locally, and this is not a public health study. This is not a formal research study, but it was done by some planning partners of ours, and I think it's public info. Yeah, it is public info. This is a comparison of population and fatalities for races in Hawaii. I think there's two different ones. One is Big Island and one is Oahu. They're pretty similar. I don't remember which one I pulled, but what you're looking at here is the blue is population and the orange is the number of fatalities. So what would be concerning is if there were a much higher orange line than blue line next to a certain population. And sure enough, what you see here is that Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander are wildly overrepresented in our traffic fatalities. Wildly, right? Everything else is close. I mean, Asian is overrepresented, but Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander is really, really dramatically overrepresented. That's a big cause for concern. So that's kind of a really stark local example. This is an interesting one. Obviously, we don't have to worry about snow. I'm from Colorado for a while, so I'm really glad I'm not worrying about snow like my in-laws are today. But this is interesting. An analysis of Sweden's snow clearance practices showed that it disadvantaged women who were more likely to walk, while employment districts where men predominantly worked were more likely to have their streets plowed first. So not only was there an impact on snow clearance priorities, but there was a negative consequence for society as a whole, and that 3 times as many people were injured walking in icy conditions in Sweden than while driving. And the cost of those injuries far exceeded the cost of snow clearance. So what Sweden did, was just kind of famous, was reprioritize their snow clearance. They said the first thing we do when it snows is sidewalks. And that makes it so that that women and the kids getting to school and that other people that have domestic, more local domestic travels rather than travels from suburbs to business centers are prioritized. Their safeties are prioritized, and looking at other commutes rather than just like work commutes, 9-to-5 work commutes, is a really important step that we can take. And it's actually a big systemic problem that we have in transportation planning, is how intently we focus on work commutes and not on caregiver commutes, or what it's called trip chains, which are more complex travel behaviors that involve, caretaking and errands and groceries and things that are considered to be domestic chores and are disproportionately usually women. So those are some examples, right, of equity, and we can talk. There's obviously many more than that. Enforcement, and this is also the interesting about, of course, enforcement. Better enforcement means smarter and fairer, not just tougher. I do want to do a quick trigger warning to racial violence before I click on the next slide. It's just a slide, and it's not a graphic, but it's just a kind of a troubling thought. I think that we have a real problem with using police in this country as a tool of achieving public health and safety goals. And what happens when you have a police force where you know that systemically we do have an issue with disparate enforcement, where it is not uncommon for police to use enforcement as a pretext for harassing or for incarcerating people who are in places that they don't belong or are perceived not to belong. This is a story. There's one of many stories of a police officer trying to pull over a bicyclist strictly because he didn't have a light, and it ended up ending his life. And that's sort of a really troubling and upsetting example to me of a really, really common phenomenon, which is pretextual enforcement, and the idea that we have to be very, very careful when we talk about using enforcement to solve public health and public safety problems. 2020 made it more difficult than ever, I think, to ignore that relationship between American law enforcement and communities of color. So when we talk about safe streets, that has to mean safe from everybody, for everybody, and it has to mean more than just safety from cars. It has to be safety to move about without fear of being targeted for enforcement or harassed because of your identity. And I didn't get into it, but there's a lot of other reasons why identity could lead to public harassment, whether it's police harassment or sexist harassment or homophobic harassment, right? There's a lot of other dimensions to safe streets besides just safety from cars. And I think unless we consider those wholly, consider them systemically, then we could do real harm in an intent to make things safer for a certain subset of the population. I think Hawaii sort of, I think, prides itself maybe on not being as susceptible to that, those sort of racist policing and disparate impacts, but it turns out that that's not true, that there's plenty of evidence that Honolulu Police Department and other police forces have just as big of a problem with implicit bias. Time and time again, evidence shows us that Hawaii law enforcement is susceptible to the same implicit biases as police everywhere else. So to close on enforcement, there are many organizations that focus on transportation equity and transportation safety that have removed the enforcement E altogether or replaced it with encouragement or something like that. Some orgs are eliminating altogether. Others are focusing on community policing, automated enforcement, passive enforcement, or restorative justice. Other ways to manage enforcement without specifically talking about policing. This is the Safe Routes National Partnership. I would not categorize the Safe Routes National Partnership as being like a particularly radical lefty woke organization, but they, as a national group, I really applauded their leadership. Effective immediately, we are dropping enforcement as one of the 6 E's. Enforcement cannot be part of a program focused on improving kids' safety and health when police threaten the health, safety, and very existence of Black and brown kids in the country. So kudos to them. So you get all that. What are you left with? What is the focus of Vision Zero? Vision's about focus. I used to race bikes. And when I raced bikes, I had a mentor that told me, don't focus on rocks and potholes and gutters, because the best way to make sure that when you are racing a bike, the best way to make sure that you hit something is to look at it. But what you want to do is you find the line. And by finding the line and being aware of the pitfalls and being aware of the obstacles, you're more likely to be able to navigate through them. So by focusing on becoming and focusing on what you want to be, rather than focusing on what you want to avoid, you can see the obstacles coming and have time to find a path around them, and you can be planning for what's next. So when we talk about Vision Zero, where are we and what are we focusing on? How are we not just focusing on what we want to, how are we focusing on what to become and not just what to avoid? So we broke down some of the big ideas, and here's some steps. Here's some actual concrete, it's kind of a focus statement, if you will. So focus on what works. Pursue data-driven solutions. Treat community and lived experience as invaluable technical assistance. Learn from peer cities, but center local culture, values, and needs. Focusing on what works means finding the data and being creative with it. Focus on building a diverse coalition with shared vision, language, data, responsibility. So that means co-creating narratives that gives practitioners and communities a chance to be their own heroes rather than subjects of the state story or the planning department story or the advocacy group story. And for Vision Zero to be useful, everything has to be on the table. So everyone has to be at the table. I've worked on Vision Zero campaigns in a lot of contexts over the years. The programs that I've watched fail are the ones that just dumped an unfunded mandate onto a transportation department. Again, I said this earlier, but Vision Zero has to have ongoing stewardship and dedication and funding. For it to be useful, everything has to be at the table. Advocates and planners and engineers can come up with all the plans and designs and projects in the world, but traffic violence is not fundamentally a design and engineering problem. It is a cultural one, and we will not solve it until we collectively decide that it's a problem worth solving. The third thing is focusing on resilience over compliance. So engineers and planners love to joke about non-compliance and how they can engineer things or make plans that are more compliance. And that's a really complicated relationship. The relationship between designers and users is super complicated. But the clear answer to safer systems is to make systems that are more tolerant and more resilient in the face of non-compliance rather than being punitive. You can't assume that non-compliance can or should be punished away, but you can design systems that can account for it and be resilient and forgiving when users are non-compliant. And some systems can even thrive when users aren't compliant with the design that you originally laid out for them. So focus on what works, focus on building a diverse coalition with shared values, language, data, and responsibility, and focus on resilience over compliance. And that leads to my kind of closing question on this is, are we ready for Vision Zero? It is really progressive. It is really challenging. You know, we are stuck in a very different way of doing things. Do we have a date for Vision Zero here yet? No, I don't think we do. Do we have a coalition? Do we have the shared language and vision? I would argue that we do not. I think that there are pockets of it happening. I think that there's movement in the right direction, but we didn't get here overnight. You know, this has been 100 years in the making. The solutions have been clear for 100 years. We've been ignoring them and avoiding committing to solving the problem for 100 years now. So it's time to solve it. Because, and this is one of my favorite expressions, but the best time to plant a tree was 20 years ago. And the second best time is today. So that is me on Vision Zero, and I really appreciate it. And I will stop sharing my screen now.